So, welcome. This is the second panel on commercial tracking. My name is Scott Peppett. I'm a professor here at the law school. And I'm going to just do a couple of introductory things, and then we're going to jump right into the panel. The first introductory thing is just to thank Paul Ohm, wherever Paul Ohm ended up. Oh, there he is. This is, as Phil Weiser said, really a tribute to Paul and his work over the years in building this conference. And as he said, it's a privilege to have this group at the law school, but it's primarily a privilege to have Paul around because I think I'm going to get him a t-shirt that says greatest colleague ever. Thanks to you for inviting me to do this. I do want to reiterate something that Paul said just by way of framing the whole conference, which is we are trying to focus this conference on harm, on privacy harm. A few years ago, Paul wandered into my office, or I was in his office, I don't remember which one it was, and he was talking about how we don't really have a good sense of, or a good understanding, or a good enough understanding of what exactly the privacy harms are that we worry about. And at the time, to me, it felt a little vague, like I wasn't really sure what he was talking about, except that it probably was really smart and I should go back to my office and figure it out. A few years later, it feels increasingly not only right, but important as it gets harder, I think, in some ways, to articulate what exactly are we concerned with and what would be useful or important enough to justify some kind of action, intervention, regulation, whatever. So that means essentially we don't want to talk about benefits all that much. And if you do in your questions, I'm going to sort of politely move on. And we don't really want to talk about prescriptions either, although that's just incredibly hard to avoid in any group like this. We do have a panel at the end of the day on prescriptions. We may end up in some discussion of that here as well, but that's really not our focus. So the last thing by way of introduction I want to do is just introduce my panel a little bit. We don't, as Paul said, typically spend a lot of time on introductions, but this is a terrific group. We're going to start with Julia Angwin on my immediate right from your perspective, who is a reporter, a journalist with ProPublica, was at the Wall Street Journal for many years, probably has done as much or more than anyone in this room to publicize some of the things that we're talking about today and to raise public awareness of it, has won various awards for that work, and is the, most important I suppose for today, the author of a forthcoming book, which I'm going to pitch, and then she's going to pitch again, and then you're going to all go order, called Dragnet Nation. I've only had the privilege of reading a little bit of it. It's got a really, do you want to stand up? It's got a really cool cover. I've had the privilege of reading a little bit of it, and you're going to hear some comments from Julia based on the book, and I think it's going to be a really important and significant contribution. To Julia's right is James Cooper, who is an economist and the director of research and policy at the Law and Econ Center at George Mason. He's also worked as the acting director of the FTC Office of Policy Planning, so he's moved both between academia and policy and government. Who's to your right? Ed Felton, who's the Robert Kahn Professor of Computer Science at Princeton, has been at Princeton for about 20 years, and also did a stint as the chief technologist at the FTC in 2011 and 2012, also been on 6 million boards, including the board of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and a longtime contributor here at Silicon Flatirons, and great to have you on my panel. We fight over our panelists, not just over Ed, but there's a lot of moving the shells around saying, no, I get her. And last in that category is Fran Mayer, who is also wears several different hats, is currently the founder and chairwoman, right? Or CEO? Chairwoman. Sure. Chair of Trustee, which is probably the most well-known company trying to promote consumer awareness and give consumers choice about tracking and commercial tracking behaviors. Also was one of the founders of Match.com and has been active in the Valley for years, decades, on branding, consumer awareness, consumer issues. So really well positioned to be talking about these tracking issues today. So what we're going to do, typical format, Julia's our one presenter is going to do a short presentation for about 12 minutes based on her book, and then I'm going to give everybody a chance to respond. I'll then go to some questions, and then we're going to open it up, and we should have plenty of time for your questions in this panel also. So,
great, thank you. You can hear me? Good. So it's great to be here. Last year when I came, I had not written a single word of this. I was just starting my book leave, and it was like it was a great environment. All of the great minds here really helped me think through and frame what did I want to write about privacy, because for 3 years prior to that, I had been writing all these stories at the Wall Street Journal, like, oh, they're tracking you here, oh, they're tracking you there, oh. And I was starting to feel that I was contributing to a sense of hopelessness in the public. And I wanted to write something that would actually sort of serve the public more. And so what I tried to do in this book is talk about why does privacy matter, actually, and what can you do about it, as opposed to just, OMG, we're being tracked. And so, and that was very prescient of me, actually, because now that Snowden has given us all these revelations, I feel like there's almost nothing we could be surprised about anymore about how we're being tracked. If we found out we were all implanted with GPS chips, we'd be like, yeah, so like that's what they're doing these days, you know? So at any rate, I spent a lot of time trying to think about the question of harm, because that really is the question of why should I care, right? For most people, until you can show me some kind of impact on my life, it's a legitimate question. Why should I care about this? So I started, though, by narrowing the scope, because privacy is this big, complex topic, and some people think what you're talking about when you say privacy is you just want to close the door when you're going to the bathroom, and I'm fine with that. Go for it. So I think what I really focused on was what I think is the most harmful part of tracking, which is what I call Dragnets. That's why I call it Dragnet Nation. Indiscriminate bulk surveillance. Like, you didn't have a reason to be tracked, right? I think you can debate. I'm sure there are going to be lots of debates about targeted surveillance, like was that a legitimate target? Is there overbroad criteria for targets? But I think that when we're in an era where dragnets are so cheap and ubiquitous, and they just weren't before, and so that is what I focused on, was what are the harm of dragnets? And I basically came up with a very simple theme to the harm, which is going to sound really obvious, but I'm going to say it anyways, which is just that information is power, right? So when somebody has information about you, they have some sort of power and leverage over you. And sometimes that can be good and sometimes that can be bad, but most people here might have kept something from their spouse once or twice, so I think that we all can understand that that's always a negotiation. How much information do you want to give out in any kind of transaction? And so what's happened with all these dragnets and ubiquitous surveillance, it means that you're sort of shedding information in places that you don't realize it, right? So your transaction, you think you're done buying this thing at Amazon, and that should be the end of the transaction, but no. The next time you go there, they're like using that same data to try to shape your next choices, which in many cases can be quite beneficial, although I'm sorry that was a benefit. I take that back. There are no benefits, only harms. But I think that it's worth just considering what does that mean on a mass scale. And what I came to believe was that in one large, simple way, all this information that you have about you that you don't control, that's being swept up into dragnets, really allows you to be hacked. And I use hacked in an extremely broad term, right? So basically, you could be hacked by Chinese hackers, or you could be hacked by a spammer who knows enough about you to get you to click on a link, right? But in general, the idea is this information can be used to manipulate you in some way, right? And so I came up with a list of ways that you can be manipulated. And this is not comprehensive in any way. It is just meant to be instructive and a starting point for the discussion. So one way that you can be hacked, or way is you can always be found, right? I got a Christmas card. I am very private, by the way. I love privacy. Try to remove all my data from data brokers, but I got a Christmas card from somebody who didn't know my home address, and on it was scrawled, "Found your address online, ha ha," right? So even though I have contacted 200 data brokers, asked them to remove my information, and done all the things that only somebody totally obsessive would do, I can always be found, right? And similarly, with cell phones, I can always be found if my phone is on, essentially. And so this means that it's very hard, to protect your locational privacy, right? And the obvious example is that stalkers, right? So stalkers have used these databases to find their victims. They continue to use them all the time. And so it is just, there have been some limits put in place by the data broker companies that try not to sell to unreputable people, but still, you can go online and buy my data for 75 cents at some online data broker. So that's one harm, is you can be found. Another harm is you can be watched, right? We've seen many cases where people's web cameras have been hijacked by criminal hacker rings. You know, there's one ring, and I can't remember their name, but they basically would take control of teen girls' cameras and then take pictures of them naked when they didn't notice and then use it to extort them for money. Bad, right? So the fact that you can't control sort of things that view into your home can end up being really problematic. And now we have Google Glass, so we can also do this to each other. And then there's the drones that are small enough to fly and look in your windows. So we are in an era where you can really be watched, and there can be harm there. Very simple privacy harm, actually, which is just you didn't want to be watched. And it can be used for extortion. Then there's the harm of, can you really ever keep a secret anymore, right? I mean, if the head of the CIA, David Petraeus, can't keep his affair secret, you know, I think that we're all going to have problems keeping secrets. And certainly, a lot of people have had experience of thinking that they posted something in some constrained way, and then somehow it turned out that actually it was like there was a Google, you know, a Google setting or a Facebook setting that allowed it to be shared more widely than they thought. And I'm not singling them out, but that does happen more often than not on social networks. And you know, and then there's like, for instance, the copyright trolls who go out and like try to find the IP addresses of everyone who's downloaded porn, and then take them to court to sue them for copyright infringement, and it's a shaming experience, right? Just settle, or else I'm going to tell your wife that you downloaded porn. So the ability to keep a secret is really harmed by ubiquitous surveillance. And then you come to sort of the classic harm, which is identity. It's known as identity theft, which I don't like to use that term because your identity was not stolen. You are you. What you are is you've been impersonated, right, for fraudulent purposes. So we have, you know, the Target breach this week, which could lead to lots of, you know, financial impersonation. One thing that's interesting is that in the impersonation world, tax and medical fraud are on the rise, and in part because consumers have easier access to their credit reports, so they can at least see if their score is all wacky, but you can't really tell if somebody's using your insurance to get treatment at the hospital or to file fraudulent tax returns. You don't have as much transparency into those crimes. And so impersonation is a big category of harm. Then there's a category of harm that gets a little fuzzier, which is, you know, I call it the hall of mirrors. Elliot Pariser calls it the filter bubble. But essentially this idea that when you're online, all you see is sort of the remnants of your digital past, right? So the targeted ads. But it's more than ads, you know. There's 2 years ago in the run-up to the 2012 presidential election, I did a story about how Google had an algorithm that basically had determined through some automated process that people who looked at Obama news wanted to see Obama results in their subsequent searches. So if they did a search for Obama, the next few searches they did, whether it was for guns or anything, you know, it would say search answers for guns, and then 3 searches, Obama plus guns, and then the rest of your gun results. And when you did the same thing for Romney, their algorithm had determined that Romney people didn't really want to see that, so there was no Romney plus guns bucket in there, right? And so coming from a newspaper background, that was shocking to me, because the idea that like if you read an article on the front page about Obama and then in the section on personal living, they added like in the toothpaste article section about Obama's thoughts on toothpaste, people would literally revolt, right? They would like, that's such a biased newspaper. But this is sort of what automated filtering does. And when I called Google, they legitimately said, look, we hadn't updated our algorithm in the run-up to the election, and it was totally unintentional, and, you know, that's that, and that is that. But except for the fact that, like, when my kids look for things online, you know, are they only going to see certain filtered results? Like, what kind of view of the world does that present to us? So that's a harm. That's like at a societal level, but it is still an important harm. And then you get to financial manipulation, right? So ability to know something about you before you begin a financial transaction automatically diminishes your negotiating behavior. Anyone who's ever been in a negotiating means you don't walk onto the car lot and say, okay, here's my income. What do you think? What's the price going to be, right? You want to keep some of that in your back pocket. But the fact that your data is out there means that it's much harder to keep that information to yourself. So a lot of the work that I did at the Wall Street Journal in the past couple of years was trying to quantify that. So we definitely found, a progression. In the early years, I think in 2010, we showed how Thomas and Carrie both came to the Capital One website, and they basically pinged them, looked at their cookies, looked at their IP address, and automatically, instantly tailored the website. So Thomas was analyzed as having upper to middle income, and he was given their best card as the first showing. And then Carrie was, shown as mid-scale income, and she was given a sort of mediocre card. Now, to be fair, that they could go deeper in the site and get any card, apply for any card they want, right? So this was not there was not a violation of the Fair Credit Reporting Act as far as I understand the law, which is this much. But it was tailoring, right? And then we did another study in 2012, and we found it was gotten a lot further, right? So we saw that Staples was selling its staplers, and actually most of its office supplies for different prices to different zip codes. Now, those zip codes, it was based, as far as we could tell, on the distance from a competitor's store. So there was like a legitimate business reason. Like if you're near Office Max, you're going to get a lower price because we don't want you to go to the store and buy it at Office Max. But it's also worth noting that people who live near Office Max were higher income and more white than the people who lived away from them and got worse prices. So we're going to have to rethink what do we mean by redlining, because these algorithms are going to change our understanding of what is redlining. Is it, if the algorithm determines it, it's not intentional, but people are getting different prices and they can't really adjust for it, we have to think about as a society, where do we want to draw that line, right? Then finally, you get to, I'm sorry, we're going to have to dip into government a little bit, but just because there's commercial data out there, the government dips its hand in, right? And you can't ignore that as a harm, right? These troves of data, if we've learned anything from the Snowden revelations, is these troves of data that the commercial entities own are irresistible, right, to the government. And they're coming in the front door and getting it, and then they're also hacking it in the back door. And so you have to consider the harm of holding this data, because the government wants it. And you can't, and once you know that the government is looking at all that data, and all of a sudden the impact goes from paying more for a stapler to possibly be put on the no-fly list, right, the stakes go up. And then you lead to the ultimate harm, which is the chilling effect of knowing that everything you're doing is being monitored, and how do you curtail your speech in the face of that? And that, I think, is a societal effect, hard to quantify, but one that I think we have to consider as well.
Fantastic. Perfectly on time. So let's just go down. James, 5 minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, and I want to thank Paul again for inviting me to be here. It's an honor to be here on a panel with such fantastic people. I would break my. I'm putting on my economist hat to think about this and how I think about these harms. I mean, this panel is about harms from commercial tracking, and so leaving aside, let's cabin for the time being the harms from like the target data breach, where you can actually put a number on it, right? I mean, you can say my credit card was fraudulently charged X. I mean, that's easy. Where I think some of this gets more difficult is when we talk about the harms from surveillance. And I'll break this down even further. I think there are two parts of this: the tracking. There's the actual collection, and then there's what do we do with the data that we have. So on the collection side, and I'll be Paul had mentioned earlier that this will probably be used a lot. I may be the first person to use that creepy feeling today. I don't know if I get a prize or something for being the first, but so that's kind of maybe what we're talking about. We're talking about the I go from I happen to get ads that it's clear that people have been following me around on the web. I have people, that idea that I'm being surveilled. Now, I'm not here to say that that's not harm. It clearly is, but the problem is we all feel that harm differently, and there's no external way to verify what that harm is. There's no external benchmark. I can compare, from the target breach, I lose $50, Ed loses $500. We can compare that. Okay, Ed lost 10 times as much as me. For something like the creepy harm from surveillance, it's a harm, but it's not externally verifiable, and second, it's likely to vary greatly throughout the population. Okay, so we probably have a broad distribution of how we suffer those harms. And what does that mean from a policy standpoint? And I know I'm kind of delving into let's not just talk about harms, but getting into a little bit of the policy. But I think that it brings up some cautions we have to think about. And again, I do want to emphasize, I'm not saying, that we need to just poo-poo these harms, that, so what, I'm followed around. Some people may feel that way, others don't, and I certainly respect that, the whole spectrum, the whole distribution of harms. But before we start making policy or enacting regulation based on subjective harms, we should think carefully about some of the problems that may arise. First is this idea that if we set out maybe one uniform policy or one uniform regulation to deal with this in the commercial side, then there's going to be assuming we have a fairly large distribution of how we feel these surveillance harms, there's going to be a lot of mismatch. And when there's mismatch, there's going to be harm. Okay, so some people way out here in the tail are going to want a lot more protection. They don't want to be tracked at all. We want some really stringent regulation. People down in this other tail, they could care less. The more the better. And in between, there's going to be a lot of mismatch if we set one standard, especially if we set one standard that's based on maybe the upper end of the tail. So there can be a lot of, and that's one of the problems that comes out of, again, not an objectively verifiable measure of harm, or one where there's a broad distribution. I think that there's also a problem with uncertainty. This just comes out of I'm putting my economist hat on, but just kind of the accident or economics of torts literature. That whenever you have whenever regulators are going to be setting a standard under uncertainty, and this is clearly an area where you may know the distribution, but which I don't think we do, but you're going to have an uncertain standard. That's going to lead to over-deterrence. Okay, so firms are in this space who'd be affected by this are going to think twice and maybe reduce a feature or take whatever actions they need to take to avoid liability. Okay, because they don't know exactly what that's going to be. Again, that's just pure from Chevelle and others tort literature that's been developed for a long time. And finally, when we think on the collection side and the problems that come up with dealing with undefined or subjective harms, and I'd probably get in trouble back at George Mason if I didn't bring public choice up at least once in my talk, is that when you've got you've got the subjective measure of harm, that leads to a lot of regulatory discretion. And when you have lots of regulatory discretion, well, people spend a lot of money trying to convince regulators to do things. There's an old adage in economics that rectangles are bigger than triangles. Now, for those of you who took micro, deadweight loss from some sort of pricing above marginal cost, some sort of market distortion leads to a triangle. But what's at stake is the larger rectangle, the profit. And firms rationally invest up to that rectangle, and many firms. So the more discretion you give to the regulatory apparatus, the more is going to be spent trying to convince that apparatus to move one way or another, and that's just wasted resources, right? I mean, that's just about spending money to transfer from A to B or B to A, and so the more discretion you give, the more rent-seeking you have. So let me move quickly to this idea of. So we talked about collection, the harm that comes from collection. Then there's a harm that comes from use, and things that, I mean, I would say that, again, as an economist, I think better matching is good. Okay, and some of the harms that Julia talked about, I would categorize those as, and I'll use the B word, benefits. But I think that better matching with credit card rates, better matching. I'm seeing ads that are more relevant. I mean, it's those. We shouldn't view the consumer business transactions as zero sum, and I think that's kind of built into some of this. That the business is just trying to screw it to the consumer. Any transaction that occurs is, by definition, it's welfare enhancing. Okay, now maybe the producer extracts most of that, but it still is making the pie. It's making the pie bigger. So if we define, and I think that goes to another issue, is how are we defining harm? Are we defining harm with a consumer welfare standard or one with a total welfare standard? And this is kind of nomenclature that you get into in antitrust a lot. But if we're talking about social welfare, the pie, to the extent that the better matching and better targeting leads to more underlying transactions, then that's a good thing. Okay, that I wouldn't call that as harm. Now, some people get worse terms than they otherwise would get. That's a consumer harm, right? They're paying more than they would. They're getting a higher interest rate than they ordinarily would. But again, and then finally, because I'm sure I'm out of time. But the last thing I'd say, maybe we can get more into this in discussions. I wouldn't ignore the impact of competition here, because it seems a lot of this is the price discrimination arguments are taken in a vacuum. That you need to think that okay, maybe there's inaccurate that firms have an incentive to compete with one another to get the matching more accurate, to make sure that, listen, if I get the high interest rate credit card because I've been inaccurately put in as a high credit risk, others will want to get my business. If sort of the living in if I'm getting things that I shouldn't be getting, other firms will do that. There's one other thing, other firms will try to target me more accurately. And then the final thing I would just add is that, price discrimination, there's monopoly price discrimination, again, that we all learn. There's one firm, and they kind of divvy up the area under the demand curve and charge different prices. But there's also, and this gets ignored a lot, is what's called competitive spatial price discrimination. I'm surprised that, I wrote a landmark article on that back in 2005. So, Antitrust Law Journal, volume 72. Anyway, if anyone's interested.
It doesn't have the punch of Dragnet Nation.
I wonder if I can get that. But the point there, and I'll just say, is that there's this idea of maybe, firms can there's this idea of discrimination, and let's categorize my high-valued users and charge them more, my low-valued users and charge them less. That's monopoly price discrimination. But when you're trying to charge your high-valued users more, you forget that there's another firm over there. Okay, there's another firm that says, oh, well, Staples is charging you that? Well, I'm Office Depot. Let me target that. How many of you have gone to the grocery store, bought Dannon yogurt, and then what spits out on the machine is something for Yoplait? Right? That's targeted spatial price discrimination. That is an algorithm where they say, okay, hey, I think you prefer Dannon, and so I'm going to give you a discount to come over to Yoplait. And I think that you're going to see that the technology that exists today, you can see that more and more. And if you take this competition and that when you think about this, we need to think about the competitive environment as well. So anyway, I've gone way over, and I apologize.
All right. Ed.
Okay, I'd like to expand a bit on something that Julia talked about a little bit, and that is the link between commercial data practices and government surveillance, and the types of harms that can flow from that linkage. So I'll talk a little bit about the tools that governments use to piggyback on commercial data practices. I'll talk even less about how we might think about a policy approach to this harm, and then even less than that about things that companies might do to mitigate this harm. So we know that governments piggyback pretty extensively on commercial collection practices. And we know that the NSA does this. We know that friendly services like, say, the British GCHQ do this. And we know that other intelligence services that are less friendly and much less subject to U.S. Political oversight also try to engage in these practices. They use a combination of legal means and technical means to do this. Legal means basically involve compelling the disclosure of information that companies have, whether it's disclosure of data about individuals who are particular targets, or whether it's a broader compelled disclosure, such as the Section 215 compelled disclosure of business record databases, which we know is occurring for phone call data, but at least if you accept the administration's reading of Section 215, could apply to a very broad range of commercial databases that companies are holding. On the side of technical means, we've seen examples of several different approaches. One involves interception of traffic between the consumer and a service. for example, a consumer's web traffic or a traffic from an app to to a server that's run by the app company. This might involve capturing metadata, capturing content, or something like looking at unique IDs or location information, or other sorts of either identifying or revealing metadata about what the consumer is doing. We've seen services intercepting internal traffic within companies. For example, traffic flowing between different data centers run by the same company as a way to get access to the company's internal data records about the activities of particular consumers. And we've seen in at least a few cases examples of active technical measures being taken involving the insertion of content and the insertion of code into for example, web pages. So there's an extensive set of means that are available frankly, there's relatively little that has been known in the computer security field that has not been used or tried by some agencies. And so to the extent that government is able to get access to data because of corporate collection or retention or use of the data, there are potential harms that we've talked about previously. So how do we think about this from a policy standpoint? These are harms which are potentially large in scope. The scope of the possible harm or what's going on is often opaque. I'll talk about this a little bit, but we often don't know very much about what is going on. That's changed to a limited extent over the past half year or so. And we as consumers have a limited ability to protect against this, partly because we really can't prevent compelled disclosure. And from a technical standpoint, we as consumers are vastly overmatched if we were to try to get into a technical arms race against an intelligence agency. So from a policy standpoint, the risk stems from the collection, transmission, and use of data by companies and the inability of consumers and often of the companies themselves to control or prevent these government uses when they're not wanted. Historically, government collection is often secret. That is, consumers and companies don't know that information is being collected. That's still true today. We know much more about collection than we did previously, but there are certainly forms of collection, types of collection going on now that we don't know about. Even where the existence of a collection method is known, often the extent of it's not known, or especially the uses are not known. And this is true even, for example, with respect to the Section 215 phone metadata records. We know that there's something going on called contact chaining in terms of a use, but the information we've been given about this contact chaining activity is, frankly, fairly superficial. We also know there is a second type of use of this data which is redacted in all of the public documents. So even for this data set, which we know is collected, we really don't, as a public, have complete information about what the uses of that are by the intelligence community, and therefore it's difficult to understand exactly what the potential harms are. Okay, so if this is something which, if this is a harm which is potentially large in scope, probably not large in scope in practice, if much about it is unknown, it makes sense to think about it in terms of risk rather than in terms of trying to identify existing instances, specific instances of harm that are going on, because we know that we will often be unable to identify those. So we want to think in terms of risk and limiting risk as the paradigm for dealing with this. Okay, so what can companies do to try to reduce this risk? The most obvious thing is to think carefully about what to collect, how long to retain it, and how to use it. In order to, to account for, in the same way that you would account for the risk of a data breach to criminals, to account for the risk of an unauthorized or unwanted use by government in making decisions about which data practices to follow. And second, frankly, and finally, there's more that companies can do to try to prevent the technical interception and insertion of traffic involved. And this means working harder to protect information in transit. It means working harder to try to protect the integrity of code and data that's shipped off to users. But that's a topic for another day.
Great. Fran?
Good afternoon. Thanks again for having me here. And it's really, Julia, thanks so much for setting up those different harms. I attempted to write a privacy book on things consumers can do, and I didn't get far enough before getting kind of frustrated with just the amount of things that consumers have to manage and understand. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about a consumer perspective based on some surveys that Trustee has done over the last year on privacy. It's mostly focused on mobile advertising, and behavioral tracking. I presume most of the people in this room understand behavioral tracking, so I won't bother to explain it. So basically, a few things to bring up here. 80% of consumers are aware that they're being tracked on the web. About 70% are aware that they're being tracked on their smartphone. So that's good, great awareness. They don't really like it. 52% of people on the web say they don't like it. 69% on smartphones say they don't like it.
It's President Obama calling.
Put it on the screen.
No problem. Of the people who are aware that they're being tracked, about 57% or close to 60% believe that actually their personal identifying information is being shared. Now, for the most part, that's not exactly happening. And so if you tell them personal information, your name and your address and how to contact you, your email address, is not being shared, their favorability towards online tracking improves a bit. Okay, so that's good, I guess. 70% of the people, and that surprises me, only 70%, understand that a lot of services on the internet are paid for by advertising. And when you tell them that, they still don't like it. About 26% of consumers say they don't. They're okay with the business model. They're okay with online tracking. Just 26%. It goes up to 36% if they think their personal information is not being shared. So again, that shift. If they understand their personal information isn't being shared, they become more favorable. And it goes up to 40% more favorable if they know that they can make a choice. And many of you probably are aware of the advertising choice icon, the eye in the little circle, where they can say whether or not they want to be tracked for behavioral advertising. But awareness of that and usage of that is still low, although climbing. So they don't like it. They're aware of it. They don't like it. Some of them like it a little or don't like it a little less if they feel that they have some choices. Yet if you ask them, would you pay for a service to reduce advertising or tracking on the web, no ads, only 17% say that they want to do that. So while they say they don't like it, they understand some of the potential harms, they still aren't necessarily willing to enter into an economic transaction to reduce that. So they do say, consumers do say, 90% of them say they are taking actions. Now, 90% of you taking actions to consistently, effectively, and efficiently to protect your privacy online? Right. I mean, so 90% of consumers are saying that they maybe are using some browser controls or are turning off tracking or going to an internet, a safe browser or a private-only browser. But clearly, they are not necessarily doing everything they can do because that list of everything they can do is very exhaustive. One of the things that's interesting is in the mobile environment, the awareness of and their willingness to share things like contact information, location information, and personal information is much reduced. Most of them do not want to do that. Yet, we know most consumers, when they have an application that says, can we share your information, or do you want to log in with Facebook or Google or whatever, they just thumb through it without really taking a very close look at what they're doing and what they're choosing. And I'll end the discussion of research here before getting to harms on who they hold responsible. I think this is important. For the 81% of consumers hold themselves responsible for their privacy and choices on the internet. So in the end, they kind of say the buck stops here with me. That's not to say that they don't want government or others to participate, but the top ranking, who was responsible for protecting your privacy, they turn to themselves, and that's true both on the web and on mobile. So I think that leads, I don't want to get to prescriptions, that we've got to really empower the consumers to do something about this. In terms on harms and sort of different distinctions in harms, we often in this room can use privacy and security interchangeably. But for the most part, security is a black and white issue. Somebody had access to something they're not supposed to get into. Privacy, though, is very subjective. What information I want to keep private versus what Julian wants to keep private can be very, very different. And also, it can change over time, and it can change across time. So I might be more privacy aware now than I was 5 years ago. And as a society, we might consider, when Facebook turned on the news feed, there was a privacy uproar. Now we kind of take that as something that we accept. So I think we have to remember the contextual and the personal nature of privacy. Distinction on harms in specifically tracking. So considerations: tracking without transparency, tracking without choice, not knowing about how much things are being shared, not understanding whether your PII is being shared or not, lack of accountability, lack of security, then of course the known unknowns, but I think the scary thing is the unknown unknowns. And even when we say, I want to share my information, whatever kind of information, with those that we trust, we are finding more and more that companies don't even understand how much information is being collected and shared. And so you want to trust a company, but when and this is not so much technology companies, although it could be true there too, but pharmaceutical companies, retailers, and so on, they often don't have the sophisticated IT security and privacy apparatus to really understand what's going on their sites and who's getting access to their information. I'll stop there.
Great. So as I said, we'll do a chunk of time with questions just to the panel, and then we'll go to your questions. I want to start with one that I previewed for you by email, but it's a compound question, just to kind of lay the groundwork here for what we're talking about. And the question is, what's the most egregious or the most troubling commercial practice? I won't say tracking practice, because it could be broader than that. It could be Capital One. It could be a behavioral advertising tracking, I don't know, that you've seen. And the compound part of the question is, if there were a Snowden coming out of the commercial data collection world right now, what's the thing you fear that person would say is actually happening that we just don't have evidence of? So for a couple of years before Edward Snowden did what he did, I sat in a couple of conversations with security folks and privacy folks, and there was a lot of conjecture that the NSA was doing some of the things that we now know, in fact, they were doing. What's the conjecture, the analogy in the commercial space that we worry about, or that you would worry about if it's in fact happening? Anybody? I won't go in order. So anybody? Yeah. And by the way, what's a dragnet?
Dragnet. It's indiscriminate sweeping up of data.
So what's the worst one? What's the worst dragnet you've seen?
The worst dragnet. Well, I'll tell you about what I think what I'm worried about with the Snowden on the commercial side is right now we have some control over commercial dragnets in the sense that if you're smart enough to educate yourself about cookies and web browsers and putting in additional software to your web browser, you can basically kind of control your environment a little bit. Within, reason, okay? But what I'm worried about is when your face becomes a cookie, okay? So once facial recognition really gets totally together, your face is the identifier. Everywhere you go, it's like you walk down the street, you walk into the store, your income flashes above your head or something, right? And they already know, and they get all the data piped to them. And then there's no opting out, right? Because it's your face, right? And we're all going to wear masks. I mean, so I feel like we kind of, I mean, I don't want to be like a tinfoil hat person, although I guess that basically is my role in life. But I do think that this is worrisome, right? Because once you get to the biometric level of tracking, I think that we have much more limited options to opt out. And then I think we really have to make a decision as a society. Are we totally fine with it's true that economists love price discrimination. Everyone pays what they can bear. And that is a perfect dream for some economists. But
I dream of it every
right,
morning.
I'm sure you do. But when you talk to the average person about it, they're kind of like, okay, I get that, like, I pay less for college because of my income. Like, that price discrimination people kind of are okay with. And they're kind of okay with price discrimination of airlines by time of when you book it. But, like, you know, every time we've ever written about these much more tailored situations, the outrage has been pretty high. And so I think as a society, we're going to have to confront that, because once we get to biometric tracking, it's going to be very easy to do and hard to opt out of.
Okay. Others, either existing practices or things you worry about?
So this is a little while back, but not that far long ago, when I understood how much information I was providing, how it could be used. And it was a Facebook ad that said, it was for a company in San Francisco, and it said over 40 and overweight. And, you know, obviously I thought that was a little bit too personal. But, you know, I think that a lot of this we put on ourselves. So right now, I'm active with a bunch of women's groups on trying to get more women on public boards, which is a big issue, probably the last bastion. And I've been tweeting and talking about this, and I had an NPR interview, and I didn't necessarily like the part of the quote the NPR reviewer took, the interviewer took, where I said, well, nobody wants an angry woman on the board. And I kind of sound like I'm an angry woman. Well, you know, I'm kind of concerned because I know that I'll be up for a board search now and again, and I'm concerned that they'll find quotes like that, take them out of context, and, you know, there we go.
So I think if I were to guess what a sort of major revelation in this space would be that would be a big deal, it would probably involve very extensive use of highly sensitive attributes of people in the commercial space. Attributes either directly extracted or purchased, or else inferred from some kind of model, which meaning that with respect to an individual, that inferred attribute either is or isn't accurate, and you know, I'm not sure which one is worse.
So just to go back to Paul's opener, I mean, isn't that target guessing that you're pregnant? Not
As
you,
an
but
example, right? So, but imagine.
I mean, so just if there is anybody who doesn't know the example that was referred to earlier, there was a lot of press a while back because we figured out that Target was using all sorts of data it was collecting to come up with a pregnancy score, essentially, and to figure out whether women who were shopping at Target were or were not pregnant. It was quite predictive, quite accurate, great for marketing purposes.
So the question is, how deeply does an inference like that get into the commercial data ecosystem?
Right.
Right? And if there's a lot of that kind of inference going on, and that information is being sold, swapped, or passed around in real-time bidding scenarios, for example, I think that would wake people up.
So to put a point on, I mean, so for example, if it were discovered that insurance companies were inferring and trading information somehow on whether you were sick and just didn't know it yet, or were sick and knew it but hadn't told anyone yet, that would, you think, have some PR value?
Sure. Or, for example, you know, a demonstration that anyone by buying some online ads can get a list of pregnant women, or
right.
whatever it is.
Right, right.
Some of it would have to do. You know, I'm spinning a scenario here that would get people upset.
So
and would involve information being readily available to pretty much anyone who shows up.
Right, and when you think about what is sensitive information in that context, a lot of it is what you used to call sucker lists, right? So the sucker list is going to change, right? It's like who's weak and financially vulnerable, and it used to be like basically, you know, you sort of, the data brokers, you could try to buy like something that might resemble that, but it would basically be the mailing address to send junk mail and sweepstakes to some old people. Right. But now it's going to become a totally different game, right? Which is basically the sucker list for me, if anyone wants to know, is at 10 p.m. when I'm tired, I'm a working mom, and I have to buy shoes for my kids, and I'm completely price insensitive online. I'm just like, I go online, I'm like, I don't know, just to buy shoes for children, purchase, right? Right? So that's my sucker list. And the thing is, up until now, it's been no one's had any time to develop the Julia Angwin sucker list, but like that will happen. Everyone will be vulnerable at some point, right? And so the idea of vulnerability and financial vulnerability will change.
And the cost, sorry.
Well, one of the things I was going to say is inferred versus actual stuff about us. So inferred that you're pregnant, inferred that you have some sort of issue or vulnerability or whatever, is that more bothersome to us than actual issues? So if most of us went and looked at what the online advertisers have on us in our profile, most of the time they have a lot of things wrong. So are you more bothered by the things they've inferred that they have wrong, or the things that are correct that they might be targeting on? And I don't know for myself.
So let's use that to talk about the harm, right? So when Target guesses that you're pregnant, if they guess wrong and they send you a bunch of ads for vitamins or something, is that harmful? If they guess right and they send you a lot of ads for vitamins, why is that harmful? There was almost universal condemnation of Target, and Target's response was kind of, okay, we'll take a good look at how we do this exactly. And they got busted because a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old girl, her father was quite curious about why Target was marketing pregnancy vitamins to her, and went in and complained, and they said, gee, so there's that kind of harm, being outed, essentially. But what's the harm that we're worried about with this kind of inference extrapolation?
But outing is a harm, right?
So that's a harm.
So
That is a harm.
gay and lesbian people have had this experience of being outed. We wrote a story about a woman who was in college in Texas, and she joined a queer group on campus. And the way that Facebook worked at that time is that you can be added to a group, and I believe it's still actually true, that you can be added to a group without your consent. And so at that time, there was also an automatic notification that went out to your friends. So-and-so has just joined the queer group on campus. Well, her father stopped talking to her, right? So this is inadvertent harm, but outing is a significant harm that happens. I have a story in my book of a woman who was checking her email on a shared computer in the lunchroom in her work, and her colleague was like, well, why are all the ads on your page for gay stuff, And so she was added to her colleagues, which is, that is a harm.
Mm-hmm. There's another thing that happens when you...
That's okay.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Ed, and then I'll come back to you.
there's another thing that happens if you have extensive modeling combined with price discrimination, and that is that suddenly shopping becomes a very complicated strategic game. You can't just go online and find shoes. You have to figure out what image of yourself you should present to the shoe marketers in order to get a good price or a good offer.
Well, just don't present Julia's image to apparently is the issue, right?
That is not, and that's not only a cost, but it's also something that people find extremely...
Well, not to mention the fact that we're underfunded in that arms race. So that's a technological game on which I'm likely to be underfunded, right? So as much as I'm going to try to game the shoe game, they've got better computers and more computer scientists working on their behalf.
Well, but in some ways, I don't know if it goes back to my point of ignoring competition. So somebody tries to send, you're desperate, you want your shoes right now, so the price on Amazon is higher, but who's not to say that you don't get a different ad? So I know that Amazon's going to try to take advantage of you, but I want Julie as a customer. That's the competitive aspect of this, and I think that going back a couple iterations, we were talking about the difference between accurate and inaccurate information. Is it worse that Target thinks you're pregnant and you're not, or that they do? And going back to this idea of subjective harms and distributions of harm, and the problems that are attendant to making policy with subjective harms, I think some of it, when we have reasons to believe the distribution is really tight, like I think most of us like to keep our health information private. Okay, I'm even me, an economist. I like to keep that under wraps. And so I think maybe we mostly would agree in that. So maybe we can almost treat these really tight distributions like monetary harm. Okay, we can assume that. Maybe the same thing with sexual preference, that there are true harms there. But then when we start moving out then that's when we run into these problems of subjectivity. But I do think that when there's probably certain areas of being observed. I think about the FTC's designerware case, which is one of those webcam cases. It was I think it was last fall. But someone had put, I think it was rent-to-own computers, and a lot of rent-to-own computers have some sort of tracking device, or hey, if you're going to steal this, we want to be able to find it or figure out if. But they actually had a webcam in it. And it turned out that people were watching lots of people involved in lots of intimate things that they do in their house. I think we would all agree that that's another tight distribution. Okay, it's not monetary harm, but I don't. Computers watching me undress or do other things. I think we would all agree that that's harm. But kind of going back to I guess where this whole discussion got started is where I would think that what's the worst that I've experienced, or I mean quite frankly I haven't really experienced anything that I like getting the ads, and people may know a lot of stuff about me, but I haven't experienced anything. But I do think that where this very well may be going on, not to my knowledge, but to the extent things are taken off my iPhone or my computer, like my contacts or things like that. I don't know, and I always wonder if Pandora, I listen to Pandora, does Pandora go into my iTunes library and figure out what I have in my library, or is it just a pure algorithm based on...
So Pandora was the leakiest, actually one of the leakiest apps when we tested all the apps. It took a lot of data, yeah. I don't know if they fixed it since then. But.
So I think that kind of, I think there's a distinction to be made, at least in my mind, between someone observing what I'm doing. So I go from website to website to website. That's an observation. Maybe or geolocation. I'm passing. I read the article in the Wall Street Journal the other day about the thing in Toronto. You walk around and they use the Wi-Fi to figure out more about you for the. Okay, that's observation that could always been done. It's just more cheap, and it's cheaper to do it. And to me, I think of somewhat of a property rights question. I know lots of people have looked at this from a property rights issue, but do I own the right to the observation that I walk past this store? I don't know. I don't think I do. I don't think I own the right to that. But do I own the right to the stuff that's in my contacts or in my iPhone? Do I own the right? There's going to be some sort of consent, and so I think that's where, before people get into things that I've, my contact list, maybe my iTunes library, or before people start looking at me in my intimate area. And I think that's maybe...
Although I promise you, if they're doing that, you consented to that when you signed up for Pandora. You just didn't read the privacy policy, right? So one of the challenges, obviously, which we don't have, opens up a whole classic conversation, is what consent might look like.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So let me pause for a minute and actually solicit some questions from the audience while we still have time. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time. So, Ariel, following a student has to go first.
I'm kind of starting to think that maybe my question would be for the last panel, but because this is commercial, I wanted to ask all of you this as well. So we've obviously established that firms... Is it on? No? Firms have an incentive to collect this information. And as Ms. Angwin talked about, perhaps we've kind of become numb to hearing about all these harms that happen to us and all this information. But my question is, do you think at this point that people care enough about these harms that if a business comes out and they start saying, here's the efforts that we're making to reduce collecting this information, here's the efforts we're making to reduce these harms, that the incentives for the business, perhaps in increased business and customer trust and consumer trust, in a way could combat this incentive to collect the information?
So I want to be clear, too, so that we're not just talking about behavioral advertising, right? So if a competitor to Capital One put up a website that said, our competitor Capital One is guessing who you are, and they're showing you credit cards depending on that guess, and we don't think that's fair. So we're going to show you all 5 of our credit cards no matter who you are. do they have a competitive advantage? Or
So far, I don't think that there's a level of understanding about that yet, but I would say this as somebody who spent the second half of this book, I'm just showing off again, doing exactly what you said, which I basically tried to opt out of all tracking within reason. I didn't want to live in a tin hut in the woods, but I basically tried to find services. But the thing that was interesting is that there is not a huge market yet for.
Yeah.
So I would like Gmail to just offer me a non-tracking version, but they don't have that. And so I can't pay for it. I would pay for it, but I don't have it. So I'm getting it from some other homegrown, very sweet people who are sometimes up and sometimes emails down, right? And so, there's just starting to be a market for those kinds of services, but I think it's not really been fully tested in the sense that we're just starting to see it now.
Yeah, we see with Trust Data that consumers are more likely to take actions when they see something that gives them more trust. We're not seeing that consumer services aimed at giving you more privacy or are taking off. That market hasn't really developed yet. And it's unclear whether or not, I think one ray of hope is younger people, partially because they've been trained on social networks, Facebook, to manage privacy controls, might be more interested in controlling their privacy and be more aware of how to do it because they start out as teenagers wanting to hide things. And this was a point you made yesterday, but some research has borne out that kids know how to do privacy better than adults.
although I did have a teenager argue with me for a while about why she used Snapchat because they cared so much about her privacy.
Right.
Then that didn't work out so well. But great, let's go to Chris, and then.
So people often ask about the privacy harm from all this collection, but I think there's an equally severe and significant security harm that comes from this collection too. Many of you may have read that in the past few months that a bunch of bad people were using Yahoo's online advertising network to spread malware to users around the world, mainly located in Europe, but Yahoo revealed that some of the people were in the United States. There was a fantastic research paper that was written just last week by a bunch of French researchers talking and exposing the market for real-time bidding and cookie synchronization. This is the ways that all of the online advertising networks collaborate to ensure that they all get a chance to taste your cookies and see if they know who you are. And this can then be piggybacked by other companies. And so even if you think that all of the privacy harms that people have outlined here are not a big deal and that the benefits to online tracking are super significant, the fact that any entity can show up, go to an ad network, and pay for the opportunity to deliver malicious JavaScript or malicious Java to your browser is a massive security threat. And it's one of the reasons that browsers that are now being designed with security in mind are deploying ad blocking by default. Again, not the privacy reasons, but the security reasons. This is actually something that academics have been piggybacking on too. So there's a researcher at Carnegie Mellon University named Colin Jackson, one of the finest in his subfield, who actively uses online ad networks to conduct studies of users' computers and browsers because it's a way to suddenly reach and target all of these computers. I mean, to summarize here, this is not really a question, but a comment.
We figured that out already.
But let all of these untrusted parties run arbitrary code in our web browsers, and this is the way the ecosystem has been designed. It's not the intention, but it's the result.
Right. Which is why I said hacking is really one of the biggest threats of commercial tracking is actually how hacking has evolved. So advanced persistent threat, which is what the U.S. government talks about all the time, is the biggest threat out there that the Chinese use. What it is hacking people instead of institutions. Basically, finding that one vulnerable person or the one ad that you can put in somebody's browser that you can get into their computer. So that is the way hacking has changed, and it's been enabled by this whole ecosystem.
Up here in front, yeah.
You know, sort of a tinfoil hat question. We talked about the inferences that can happen. In an earlier panel, somebody said made the comment: have you ever tried to correct your information, you know, in a credit bureau, which I've done, and it is an extraordinary pain in the what. So, but one thing I haven't heard addressed is that we now have this everyday increasing reliance on digital information for commerce, for the government. Our identity is being digitized. We all know that. But this information flows around in all these different places and is resold and repurposed. it would seem to me that one of the things that maybe hasn't occurred yet, it's getting easier and easier to manufacture who you are.
Oh yeah, I did that in my book. I made up a new person. Yeah, actually, as a counter strategy. So.
I'm talking about.
what's your
not,
name?
not necessarily for good purposes. But
Right.
I mean, if somebody says that
course.
you engaged, you went to this
Right.
website, you did this type of behavior, you make this purchase, because this information flows around over and over again without attribution, at many places in the chain, people can begin to alter that information that would make you to seem to
Correct.
be different than you are, and we have no way to tell that that's occurring or who's doing it.
The online dating world is rife with that as well.
But let me say that is a harm actually that I come to in my book, which is I say we're going to create a disinformation society, right? That's actually one of the ultimate harms, is that as you realize that I'm late to the game in creating my fake identity, but the bad guys are already doing it, right? And ultimately everyone's going to have to create, unfortunately I have to admit I created fake identities for my children because I felt that was the safest way for them to be online. But as this perpetuates, what does this mean? What is happening to our common space, right? If we're all faking it all the time.
Well, there's also
I
the
don't know
problem
why
of,
Amazon hasn't recommended your book to me yet. I'm bothered by that.
yeah. There's also the problem of FICO bombing, right? Like I could probably intentionally bomb your FICO score if I really thought about it and tried to do it with some pretty, relatively minor hacks of your life. And that would not be pleasant for you, right? If you suddenly discovered that your credit score was diving and you couldn't figure out why. We'll see. And then I could, blackmail you for payment. Yeah, right behind you.
Hi. Okay. Hi, Simon Krause, Cable Labs. Although my question's a personal devil's advocate question. If I were looking down from a spaceship and you're looking at another planet and you got this great thing, this internet with this information in it, the concerns we have could also be voiced by the commercial side, which is, gee, I'm a used car company. There's information about how much this car really cost me. There's information about when my guys are desperate to make a deal at the end of the month. We do have an arms race going on, but is it a balanced arms race, or because we're dealing with people, natural persons versus legal persons, is there a difference in that?
Right, so the consumers were winning, actually. For the first 10 years of the internet, it was like all used car guys were losing this race, right? And it was a great time. That was the time when everyone was like, the internet
Carfax.
is democratizing everything. And there was a great hope out there, and I was part of it. I had no concerns about privacy. Other people who were talking about privacy were crazy. And I was like, it's great. I'm getting the best airfares ever, right? But the balance is shifting, right? I compare this to when we first started mass industrialization, right? We built these factories, and all of a sudden we had like all this food, and it was so great, and we had cans of food, and then we were like eating all these cans of food, and then we were like, do you think it's good to eat only canned food? Like maybe not, right? So this pendulum goes back and forth, right? And we had a great period of that, but now the companies are also using their tools against us, and as I said before, we're underfunded as a consumer in that arms race.
I would just, the thinking of this as an arms race, to me, I mean, these are, more information is better. I mean, whoever has it, right? So more transactions, and this is just a distribution of surplus. Again, as an economist, I don't care about that. I'm agnostic to that. But, if the arms race is, if early on in the internet, I knew a lot more, I was able to go and get a car more cheaply because I had the invoice price, right, access to that. But now, the question is Q increasing? Is the quantity sold increasing? If it is, then the pie is getting bigger and welfare is better. So to call this an arms race, to me, that's just anathema to me as an economist to think of this as a competition between consumers. And it's not a zero-sum game, it's a positive-sum game. When a consumer and a business get together and they transact, they create surplus. Now, one party may get more of that surplus than the other, but it makes the pie bigger and it makes the world better off.
But isn't there a kind of game involving disinformation versus attempts to sort of pierce that disinformation analytically? Isn't that?
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, if you're right. I mean, if you're talking about getting involved, here's this is kind of like rent seeking, where are you expending resources just to divide the surplus, or expending resources to come to a transaction to expand the surplus? And we start to get into disinformation. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, if I'm trying to I mean, but that's part of every.
It's a big
I mean-
transaction cost,
I mean,
right, involved in me trying to trick you and you trying to trick me.
If we're talking about tricking, but as opposed to the
and then
car
we need to
dealers.
defend ourselves against the
You're,
trickery.
no,
Yeah,
you're,
right.
but again, but if we're talking, that's a different, talking about tricking as opposed to accurate information. If now the car dealer knows my income, what my last 3 cars were, a whole bunch about me, so they have better information about me, I have better information about them, then, that's more information, and we're probably more likely to have a transaction than if we had less information about each other, and then we're acting strategically. I mean, you act strategically when you're in a condition of uncertainty. And I know a little bit about the other guy, he knows a little bit about me, we want to get together. I don't want to reveal to the car dealer my reservation price. The car dealer doesn't want me to know their marginal cost, and so we play a game. And one of the outcomes of that game, in a bargaining game, is always no bargain. That's up in the upper left-hand corner. And we don't want that one. We want, either we divide the surplus evenly, or the consumer gets it, or the producer gets all of it. But if all the information's out on the table, then, the game is, we almost eliminate the game, right? We show up and I know everything about you, you know everything about me. Let's make this happen.
I think the
All right,
difference-
let me see if I can take one more question before we run out of time. So way in the back. Where's the microphone? Oh, here it is. Go all the way to the back.
I created for strategic reasons.
I agree. I completely agree with that.
All right, thank you. So I had a quick question, right? So let's say 5 years they have biometrics. When you walk into a car dealership, they have your income and other things like that, other actual data points. Is that necessarily that much worse than what car dealerships do now, where they kind of make guesses about you based on things that you say and things that you do, and sometimes they make certain guesses about you based on race or gender or perceived sexual orientation, things like that?
Right. There are people who would argue that that's actually a more rational and better way for people to profile each other.
Yeah, I mean, Leo Strelevich
right?
has written some really good work on, wait a minute, maybe more information is going to lead firms not to use proxies like race or whatever else, and actually dampen those forms of discrimination and lead to better forms of price discrimination, right? Where you're actually pricing based on something that's relevant as opposed to what you think is a relevant proxy, but is probably not, or is a proxy we don't approve of.
Paul's trying to take over.
Oh, good. Am I out of time? So,
Finish.
what?
No, finish.
Oh, okay, I'm finished. So, first off, thank you for the questions. Thank you to the panel. Please join me in thanking our panel.